Hello, my name is Jacek Bartosiak. Welcome to Strategy and Future, and today my guest is George Friedman. Hello, George. How are you?
Good. How you doing there?
Yeah, quite fine, quite fine. Where are you these days?
Right now, I am in Annapolis, Maryland, and I have to speak tomorrow to the Naval Institute here at the university.
So it's a perfect timing because I really wanted to have this conversation with you. We wrote a book together in Poland, and one of the chapters of this book was about senility, the concept of aging the weapon systems. So I'd like to talk to you today about the how you perceive the evolution of the battlefield. What are the lessons being learned now from the battlefield in Ukraine?
Well, that the World War II weapons are now obsolete. And by obsolete, I meant in the concept of senility. They can work, but the cost of maintaining them on the battlefield, the cost of defending them, has outstripped their deadliness. So we see this with the man bomber, the unmanned aerial vehicles that I wrote about, the drones. These are now the decisive airborne weapons. And in the United States, the aircraft carrier has also reached this, but also the tank. The tank is the classic World War II weapon. It is senile in the sense that, yes, it can function, but the cost, not just in terms of building it, but of maintaining it, of fueling it, of repairing it in the field and everything, makes it a very slow weapon. It is a slow weapon in an age where agility is everything, the speed at which you move. And the tank doesn't move with agility. And yes, we can protect it by building new armor and everything else, but it's not the weapon that's going to win this war, and it's not winning it.
Yeah, so if you could elaborate a little bit, because in Poland we are having a major discussion what this battlefield looks like, and we are deeply divided between this old school and the new school. The new school being, obviously, strategy and future, as you know, precision, precision munition, information dominance, OODA loop, everything, in maneuver, in agility, in dispersal, small units that are doing the job, and of course, long range fires. And the old school, of course, is mass columns, working in a traditional way, as you said, according to the 20th century manuals. So, how to could you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Well, let's look at what's happening. The unmanned aerial vehicle is, if not a decisive weapon, a critical weapon. It's a new weapon. It's one that's not been used in the war this much, but it's significant. Also, the Ukrainians have been very successful because of mobility. They could break into small units, they could move about, they could hit the enemy in a certain place and withdraw. It's almost guerrilla warfare they're fighting,
Yeah.
except their weapons are more powerful. Linked into artillery, which is really rocket fire from the kinds of weapons the Americans have sent in. But they should not be confused with tanks. The launchers don't move that much. They can move, but that's not it. It is that the amount of firepower they can lay on the battlefield is overwhelming. The rate of fire of armor is perfect against other armor. But for a well armed infantry force or well supported infantry force, it can't do it.
Mhm. So yeah, and how would what does it mean in practical terms on the front line for soldiers, for platoons, for companies, for squads? What does it look like differently, from what we see, from the movies and stuff?
Well, firstly, infantry is critical again. It is the front line. And it has to be very mobile and it has to have the ability to call on in various places in the battlefield, artillery and so on. So with the Russians, what we have learned is that they come forward in a typical formation. The Ukrainians come at you where you least expect it and you least want it. And they're able to do that because they have with them weapons that are lethal in this circumstance. They can call on weapons that are lethal, not aircraft that take 3 hours to get fueled up and so on to fly, but just weapons like the American artillery that has a huge range, deadly fire, but can't operate unless it has the intelligence coming from the infantryman. The infantryman has to be there to be able to see in a timely fashion because old aircraft can't survive in the battlefield. And the cycle for satellites is frequently too long. So this is the return of what I called in this book of the poor bloody infantryman. He's back. He's back. He is a deadly force. He is hard to kill. And this is what has frustrated the Russians, which is everything that they learned about massed force failed in the first days of the war. Massed armor couldn't even begin the logistical
Yeah,
problems.
yeah, it is telling that they face such horrible logistical issues being so heavy and so en masse. Yeah, so that's a lesson also to be
But
learned.
we already learned this in Desert Storm. The Americans always fight their wars in the Eastern Hemisphere, a long way from home. It took us almost 5 months to build up a force that could deal with Saddam Hussein. That's sad. Why? Because tanks are enormous, 50 tons. And in addition to that, they require huge amounts of POL, petroleum, oil, and lubricants. And the weight that has to be transported to the battlefield makes the battles not just slow, but allows for targeting of the offensive force. Yeah, once we got there with the tanks, we were fighting Saddam Hussein, we did very nicely. But if Saddam Hussein had been a competent general and attacked forward along the line they should have, we wouldn't have been able to defend. The problem of most of the weapons that we talk about, you know, uh, of manned aircraft and of armor and so on, traditional artillery, is that they both lack the deadliness and they really lack time to target. So you're Polish, you don't have time to target problems. We live in that world where we have time to target, but you have it too. You have that time to target. You have to get to the battlefield. Have to get to the battlefield, and with a tank, you have to get to the battlefield with the fuel, and it has not be destroyed by the enemy. And your entire battle starts to turn into protecting your armor, not using your armor, protecting its capabilities.
Mhm. Yeah, and that's a symbol. That's a moment when you enter the zone of senility. Exactly. Then
That's the
you
point at
focus on
which,
defending your asset than using.
well, the problem of the zone of stability is nobody believes they're there. They believe that the next generation will solve these problems. But the fuel consumption rates, it can't be really cut down that much. The lethality can be increased that much, the range and so on. So all of these problems stay in place. And this is historically, I mean, this has happened with weapon system after weapon system. They reach a point where they're still very functional, but no longer capable of being the decisive enemy of war. The tank, for example, was once the decisive force. The Israelis against the Egyptians used armor,
Yeah.
and that side of the war. But right now, there are so many new things on the battlefield. The only thing I'm sure of is the infantry.
Yeah. Imagine being a tank crew member. First, you need to be transported probably in the vicinity of the battlefield by tracks or by train because you can't use your tracks all around, from the strategic depth because you run out of fuel and spare parts. Then you need to face long range fires, which can really hit you with precision if you are being identified, yeah, and spotted. which is like, 50 clicks, 30 clicks, 25. Then you need to avoid the kamikaze drones being loitering munition, which has also range. Then you need to avoid the minefields. Then you need to be lucky enough to avoid the ATGMs, right, which are quite of range. Then maybe you will engage the opposite tanks if you're lucky. Uh, and then what, right?
Well, the important thing that's left out, and then you have to fuel it.
Yeah.
So when we were in the Cold War, and I had chance to observe some things of this, what the Russians did, they constantly had a logistical problem. Moving forward rapidly at the battlefield and making sure the fuel is available, vast amounts of fuel, is very difficult. One of the things I think the Americans learned is don't attack the tanks, attack the fuel if you possibly can. And this is the real, you have every problem you said I agree with, but the heart of the problem is the POL problem. You're moving in an armored formation, sucks up huge amounts of fuel, and it goes into battle. You have to provide it in battle. And the Russians never could figure that out. And in fact, at the beginning of the Ukrainian war, they didn't figure it out. They didn't know how to get the fuel to their tanks. So the idea that you're going to go in and you're going to take all these casualties and be under fire from all these weapons, and your main concern for your staff will be the POL, getting that to the battlefield.
Yeah, and on top of that, not only fuel, munitions, spare parts, and stuff that you had mentioned now, but given all everywhere existing and flying UAVs, drones, loitering munition into the depth of the front, not just at the front. You can't prepare for the counteroffensive for any offensive maneuvers because your engines are loud. You need to have at least like 20 tanks or 15. It's very loud. You can be spotted from far away and immediately covered with shelling long range. So how do you concentrate these days to make an offensive move? Yeah.
Well, this is another form of senility in the sense that you don't see fighter planes flying about the battlefield very much and doing airstrikes in support of tactical movements of troops, okay? Because they're not survivable. Well, many of the drones are not survivable, but at least you don't lose your pilot.
Yeah, plus they are cheap. They are cheap, so they are expendable.
So they're expendable. And one of the things I wrote to speak about what I wrote is that look, the fighter plane and the battlefield is finished. The unmanned aerial vehicle will carry out the missions. So across the board, we have to reconsider war. But this is not new. In World War II, we had to reconsider war so we didn't fight in the trenches again.
Yeah.
In every war we have to reconsider what it is. The winning side is the side who thinks it through first and best. The losing side is the one who has the same doctrine and will not change it.
Yeah.
And this is the essential problem of all warfare. Officers come up, they're promoted, they're air experts, they're harbor experts. They want to fight the same war they learned. What the Russians are doing now is trying to understand the new nature of war.
You think they are adjusting? They are in the middle of adjustment.
They are desperate. They may not succeed, but they're trying to think it through.
Mm-hmm.
The problem with the victorious side is they don't think they have to think it through. They don't have to really integrate. They've done things with these weapons that are so well. They have not yet integrated into doctrine. They have not created a new doctrine of warfighting, which is happening. Oddly enough, the losers, we have to think about it. So in World War II, it was the fact that there was Pearl Harbor that allowed the United States to win. Because everything suddenly became up for question. There was nothing sacred.
Mm.
And everything from amphibious vehicles to the nature of air power was reconsidered. So the victor always has the problem that to recognize the weakness of his position in spite of victory. And great powers begin to understand this. Others are called Japan. So,
Yeah. So, speaking of the Russian adjustment, how do you read this mobilization effort that they are doing now? Do you think it will translate into the more effectiveness, the larger, greater effectiveness on the battlefield soon?
well, we Americans have sergeants. The Chinese have sergeants. The Russians don't have sergeants. Who will train them?
Okay.
Some
So no,
second
no
lieutenant?
NCOs. So mobilization process is broken. Plus, on top of that, the Russians don't have the NCO score, right?
Well, they don't have a training doctrine. They don't have the buildings that are needed. They don't have the target sets and weapons for training necessary. But most important, in the United States, I once met my sergeant, and he said, "You will learn. I will teach you. You will not be happy." That person is not present in the Russian military because, in the end, you look up to him and you want to be like him. And this is the heart of infantry warfare, that you are given a sense. Now, the Russians had this in World War II. They won it in the end. They had this sense. But the idea that you're going to mobilize 10 million people, none of whom can be trained, is simply crazy. And it's also, I mean, whether they can mobilize them or not is not nearly as important a question. Because having a soldier doesn't make you a warrior. To become a warrior, you must be trained.
Mhm. I have two more questions before we end, George. Now, speaking about Polish military reform that is undergoing, like, big ticket this time around, a lot of money is being promised by the politicians to spend on the military hardware and on soldiery. Uh, what do you think, given the conduct of the war in Ukraine, given that the intermarium concept, do you think that Poland should be getting ready for the defensive war, for some sort of the active defense for war in the future, including some offensive maneuvers in the eastern buffer zone, as we say in Poland, or some sort of the coalition war together with Ukraine against Russians, like in a few years' time? So, what should we be getting ready for?
All of these. You don't know what's coming at you. So you have to have a highly flexible doctrine and weapons of various sorts to hopefully fit into all of the possibilities. So here's my view of Poland. I predicted once that Poland would emerge as large as the most powerful force in Europe in the book I wrote. Okay. It's happening now. You're not there yet, but you are one of the most powerful militaries in Europe. But it's not a tried military. It hasn't been to the front yet. It hasn't taken casualties. Well, these are all processes that are underway, but Germany has given up its position, thankfully, I think. France never had a position. Is the British. Is the British, the Americans, and who else? It's the Poles. You have most to lose, and you have a chance now to restructure yourself to a power that doesn't have a single doctrine of war, but multiple expectations of what war will look like. Because the enemy gets a vote, and he'll decide what kind of war it's going to be like, and you'll have to fight it. So flexibility is the foundation. A rigid doctrine is suicide. And you're right on the front line. Not now, maybe, but eventually they'll come for you. And you have to attack them, and you don't know how they'll come. So, what all of your weapons that you acquire now must be able to fight in various forms of contact. The American artillery is now showing itself to be very successful. We were very critical, many of us, of the artillery we're building, but it's able to fight under many operational circumstances and manages to do so without overwhelming logistical problems. So these are the things. But always remember, if you're lucky, you'll be fighting an aggressive war. And if you're fighting an aggressive war, you have to bring your supplies to the front.
Yeah.
Don't bring your supplies to the front. Don't worry about it. It's over. So this is very important, which is that Poland is now in a position that virtually any major European war will involve it somehow, in some sense, defensive or what have you. You have to study major powers and the manner in which they adapt to unknown circumstances. And that really is the task of Poland today, which is, for God's sakes, don't fight the last war. It won't work. And define not what the war is going to look like next, what kind of wars may be there, and plan for that.
Fair enough. Thank you, George.
Thank you, Jacek.
That was really a pleasure. Thank you very much. Today, our guest was George Friedman, and we talked about the intermarium, the evolution of the battlefield, Ukraine, and what's going on in the world. Thank you again, George.
Thank you.